Over to Phil, the counterpart in this conversation, which is not meant to be a kind of polar conversation, but rather a synergistic one, I hope. Let me introduce Phil, if that is needed. Phil is a product innovator, business strategist, and highly qualified research scientist. He is the founder or co-founder of More Brains Cooperative, a consultancy working at the forefront of scholarly infrastructure and research dissemination. He helps organizations of different kinds, from startups to national funders, aligning themselves to meet the changing needs of the scholarly ecosystem. After a very promising and successful cross-disciplinary research career at Imperial College in London and Harvard Business School in Cambridge, Phil was sufficiently motivated to leave academia and to start working in scholarly publishing, which we are all happy about. With his extensive experience in digital innovation and business model development, Phil is now part of More Brains and based in the UK. Phil, you will tell us now whether, or answer the question, whether technology can help in addressing the issues that we have been discussing over the last 2 days, and if so, why it didn't do it yet. So over to you. Really curious to hear what your answer is. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Sven. Thanks for that great introduction. I think some of my experience might have been expensive. But yeah, one minor correction. It's Harvard Medical School, not Harvard Business School. I've never done business.
Oh, I'm sorry. How could...
No, no worries.
Too much business.
Too much business. All right, there we go. So you should now be able to see my screen. And so, as Sven said, I'm going to talk a little bit about technology. I'm going to go into a little bit of history of research integrity sort of concerns over time, and how technology has both driven and also pushed back against those concerns. So let's start off with a brief sort of go back into history. So before we talk about the technology that the people are bringing to bear on this challenge, let's take a step back and look at some of the reasons why this has become a hot topic. So concerns about research integrity have been with us for a very long time. The first peer review, for example, is popularly thought to date back to 1731 and is attributed to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. More recently, however, there have been a series of alarms that have been raised, and I think they are increasing in frequency and increasing in urgency. So here's just a couple of them on this page here. So the one on the left is an opinion piece that was in PLOS Medicine by John Ioannidis. It ignited a lot of discussion and debate worldwide, and if you're as old as me, you may remember some of that discussion. And then, of course, on the right there is the seminal replication crisis paper from 2015 that was the series of authors, large number of authors, the lead of which was Brian Nosek, and we're going to mention him again later in the talk. There we go. So not all research integrity problems are malicious, and they vary in severity, but sometimes some very, very serious and bad things can happen, and that's one of the reasons why this is really important. In 1998, a gastroenterologist by the name of Andrew Wakefield published a paper with falsified findings linking the MMR vaccine to autism. In the investigation that followed, it emerged that he would personally stand to gain financially by discrediting the MMR vaccine so that he could sell separate vaccinations supplied by his own company. So he didn't go to prison for this, but he was struck off the medical record and medical register, I beg your pardon, but not before doing significant damage to public health. So it's not always as serious as that, but research integrity can have some very serious consequences. From around 2010, some individuals started taking personally active approach to rooting out misconduct. We've heard about the sleuths. There are a number of examples of blogs by people that started around sort of this time, after either discussing the issue in general or doing their own investigations. So these did raise a lot of awareness, and these were really important bloggers. And some of these folks, like Elizabeth Bick, for example, are respected experts in the field, and they contribute to the discussions today and are very important. On the other hand, some of them were less professional and less fair than others, which I suppose in a way is sort of inevitable, because these people were self-appointing themselves to a policing role. And if you've ever watched a Sergio Leone movie, for example, you know that some sheriffs are better and fairer than others. So I think there was a need certainly to rigorize that discussion. There was a need for a more open and fairer conversation about research integrity that focused as much on educating people on best practice as it did on rooting out those who were deliberately committing research fraud. So enter Brandon Stahl. He anonymously founded PubPeer in 2012. The site has been involved in uncovering instances of fraud as well, and it has admittedly been a little bit controversial in the past. But the ability for authors to respond to criticism, and the fact that it's a community discussion rather than a single blogger positioning themselves as an authoritative investigator, has helped minimize some of the moral hazards that some of those early investigators, I think, came up against. So this is a really good example of what I'm going to call a socio-technical approach to transparency and research integrity. So we're going to come back to this concept of socio-technical a little bit later. So meanwhile, while conversations about research integrity were often focused on misconduct, there was a growing threat of industrial scale research fraud that was emerging perhaps around the same time, but to a certain extent going somewhat unnoticed. As early as 2008, Eisenbeck Gunther published a blog post about what he called black sheep publishers, which today we mostly refer to as predatory publishers, although there are some other names that folks call them. At first, the phenomenon wasn't taken as seriously as perhaps it should have been. More of the commentary at first was aimed at how frustrating it was for researchers to receive lots of spam. The question that I think that was asked perhaps a little bit too late was, who is actually paying for articles in these pop-up journals that don't have a review process and pretend to be indexed and aren't? What would the motivation be behind doing so? I think we really struggled as an industry, both in academia and in publishing, to get our heads around this issue. And partly because we didn't have a shared definition of what a predatory publisher actually was. And the line between, and still is, and the line between lower quality journal and actual predator was a bit blurry. And it got mixed up, and still does to a certain extent, with things like cultural norms. And occasionally there's a little bit of ethnocentric privilege that gets wrapped up into these debates. And somewhat, so at the time, further back then, but perhaps less so now, opposition to open access played into those discussions and debates, sometimes in an unhealthy way. So I think we struggled to process what was happening in the best and most efficient way. Now, predatory publishers do still exist, but a more dangerous threat has emerged. Now, we've heard a lot about paper mills over the last 2 days, so I won't go into a lot of detail. All I want to say about them is the reason why I think they're more of a problem than predatory journals, and they're more dangerous, is because it's a far more scalable model. There's more incentive for a researcher to do it, because they get to publish in prestigious journals rather than a journal that perhaps nobody trusts. And they're also more difficult to spot, because you have to look for the papers rather than the journal. And they're getting more difficult to spot over time. So now let's turn our attention to some of the recent efforts to push back against research fraud on both the individual and the industrial scale. In 2022, STM and COPE collaborated on a joint report about paper mills. I was in the STM masterclass on research integrity back in, I think, December 2022 was when the report hadn't been out long. There was lots of concern about it. And the findings of this were discussed there by representatives of some of the publishers involved, some of the research integrity folks. STM were there and COPE were there. And it was quite an interesting and lively debate about how to tackle this stuff. The meeting was conducted under Chatham House rule for obvious reasons. So all I can say is that the discussion was pretty sobering. It's clear that fraudsters had been generating fake articles. Paper mills had been in existence for longer than people really realized. And the problem isn't limited to any particular review model and not limited to any particular publisher. There's a number on there of 1.5%, which, according to, is on the Blue Skies website. That's their estimate of the prevalence of fake papers in the literature in general. In the report from STM and Cope, they note that some journals have as many as 46% of their articles generated by paper mills. So as was said earlier today, these paper mills, these types of criminals target specific weak journals and try to find weak spots in our defenses as an industry. So in response to that report, as well as the growing threat that publishers see from research and publishing fraud, all of the things that we talked about, STM Solutions was created what they call the Integrity Hub. So Martin mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's sort of a multifaceted forum for discussion and information exchange, and it's also a shared cloud environment for applications and data. So Martin talked about the human components of that, and the forums and the discussions and all the rest of that. So I'm going to focus on the technology part of what they're doing there. So at its core, the core technology of it is it's a shared cloud compute platform. When I saw the demo, it was an MVP stage, when its flagship application was a tool to screen articles, individual articles, for evidence of paper mill generation. But the plan is to add more tools over time, and that has been happening. The shared cloud service is a bit like a secure compute environment, and that's similar to the sort of thing that's used by some university departments, pharmaceutical companies, so on, for collaboratively working together on sensitive data. In this case, it's commercial and security data that's being shared. They've also done some work comparing various research integrity tools, specifically a set of tools that focus on microscopy and biochemistry gels, which I think is interesting because that's the sort of area that many of those early sleuths that we talked about tended to focus on. So that sort of image integrity checks is a ripe area of innovation right now. So how does this paper mill detection thing actually work? So as you all well know, tools to detect plagiarism have been around for a while. Perhaps the best known one is Authenticate. Maybe some of you use it in your workflows. Paper mills didn't want to get caught by those tools. And if they just recycled chunks of text, that's what would happen to them. So they run sentences through a thesaurus and they substitute in similar words. It's sometimes called rogeting, and it generates what's called tortuous sentences. You end up with some of the sort of questionable translations that are on the left of this side, which was taken from a table is taken from a 2022 article that's cited on the page there. There are some really good ones here. Random value becomes irregular as steam. And I think my favorite is big data becomes colossal information. So you can imagine sort of reading these papers and these sort of words are sort of slot in and you go, what on earth is that? It's and you can see where they come from. Anyway, this may dodge tools like plagiarism detection software, but it leaves behind sentence structure fingerprints, and those are detectable. The drawback is that it becomes a bit of a game of cat and mouse because the paper mills can simply rotate the different base text that they're using. So new fingerprints would come up, and you have to sort of find those and so on and so forth. Another tool that I think is really interesting. They're partnering with Clear Skies to have the paper mill alarm product. This one is it's more of an intelligence tool, and it looks across a variety of data sets and performs network analysis. It looks for suspicious patterns of activity, and it matches articles and even manuscript submissions against those patterns. It's the brainchild of data scientist Adam Day. And I think Mike actually mentioned some of the network analysis that they do sort of at Wiley, which I don't know if they're using this particular tool, but this is the sort of thing that, similar sorts of network analyses. So these are great technologies, and they do have a really important place in fighting back against things like paper mills. The challenge is that what you can end up doing is just driving the fraudsters to up their game. You sort of end up in competition, and a sort of technological arms race is already underway. Now, somebody mentioned earlier in our sort of green room chat that that there are fewer tortuous sentences cropping up in articles these days, despite the fact there's not much evidence the paper mills have packed up and gone home. So, and I think this, what I talk about here is perhaps relevant to that observation. So I asked the question, what's next? Fraudsters came up with tortured sentences to avoid being spotted by plagiarism detection. How will they avoid the grammatical fingerprint detection techniques? Well, one such way that they might do that, once the success rate of thesaurusing things drops and rotating the base text doesn't work very well anymore, they can simply move into using something like a large language model. LLMs work by generating text based on most likely words after a string of words. It's a bit like an autocomplete, but it's far cleverer because it looks at a range of different semantic dependencies over many paragraphs. That allows it to create consistent tone and style, and it doesn't generate text in predictable patterns. Currently, there is no way to detect whether something has been written by a large language model. Despite what anybody may try to sell you, I've not seen any convincing evidence that anybody can detect them, at least not programmatically. OpenAI even had to pull their own AI text detection tool because it was completely inaccurate, even at spotting text generated by GPT itself. So if people who produce these models can't even tell their own outputs from human written text, then you can't detect them yet. Not to scare anybody, but here's the scary slide, at least from the point of view of this talk and this narrative. There are a lot of models out there, and many of them are open source. Now, I don't want to criticize open source because it's a fantastic thing. It's great news if you want to do something amazing in generative AI. And in fact, I know that Adam Day, who runs Blue Skies, uses a lot of LLMs in his work. So I'm no way suggesting that open source is somehow bad. It isn't. It's a huge net positive. But that's another talk that's that's about the difference between open source and proprietary code. The dark side that I'm pointing at here is that LLMs have significantly reduced the marginal cost of generating plausible nonsense, while simultaneously making it way harder to detect. Pretty much anybody fairly easily can take one of these open source models, deploy it, train it, and use it to generate text. So what are we going to do? If we make a better mousetrap, the mouse will get cleverer. Technology has a valuable role to play in helping us deal with these issues, but technology on its own is not a magic bullet. So that's not to say it won't help. It will. The work in the Integrity Hub and others are doing is absolutely really important and critical to all of this. It's just that we need to tackle this problem from multiple angles. The reality is that research fraud is a socio-technical problem. It's caused by the interaction of technology and social incentives and pressures. And I won't go over those. You've heard lots about that already. So our solutions must similarly address both aspects. Let's take a step back. What's the real problem here? The real issue is that a large number of research findings cannot be reproduced. On some level, whether that's because somebody paid to generate a fake paper or just didn't apply enough rigor in the rush to publish a positive result, that's almost sort of secondary. We know there is a problem because researchers say so themselves. One thing I didn't cover in this talk is the discipline of meta-science, which in part looks at quantifying issues like the file draw problem, p-hacking, harking and stuff. This is a real challenge. The underlying problem is that researchers are not always incentivized to do good research. In fact, as a former postdoc, I can tell you firsthand that there is often huge pressure to work to a lower standard of rigor in order to get that high profile publication. So I'm going to say honestly what I've always said. The traditional point at which quality control happens in scholarly communications is too narrow. There is so much that goes into research before something is written for publication, from ideation to funding application, developing experimental design, data gathering, processing, synthesis, and interpretation. In the traditional model of scholarly comms, all that stuff sort of stays in the desk and very little is done around quality control. That means that not only do researchers get tempted to cut corners, but they're often not enough feedback, which results in bad practice almost emerging organically. So we need to change the incentives to drive accountability, integrity, and trust. Accountability happens through transparency. There are some really interesting approaches that have already been deployed, being developed. I hope many of you are familiar with ORCID trust markers. What these do is they make it clear in your ORCID profile who is making an assertion. For example, if I say I got my PhD at Imperial College London, you may well choose to believe me, but let's say you didn't. You'd have to engage in a bit of gumshoe private investigation to know if I'm telling the truth or not. If Imperial College say that I did, then you'd have far fewer doubts. That's what trust markers do. They add currency in the form of validity to the ORCID record in a way that people will hopefully want to protect. Another form of transparency is registered reports, which came up in one of the questions David Warlock, I think, asked about it. Imagine a situation where you have to tell the publisher in advance how you're going to conduct the research, and they promise to publish it irrespective of the outcome. Most of you probably already know this is increasingly common in medical research, particularly in clinical trials. That is a way of creating a paper trail that is harder to fake than just a manuscript. There's a lot of work going on with data management plans, particularly machine actionable DMPs. This is where a researcher can document how they're going to gather the data, store it, process it, make it onwardly available in a way that's machine readable. Therefore, it can be discovered, aggregated, it's interoperable, and it can be used for automation. This is an area of very active research at the moment. There's a paper from 2019 in PLOS Computational Biology about the general principles, which you should go and have a read if you're interested, it was recently reviewed actually in a workshop organized at the Digital Creation Centre in Edinburgh at the IDCC conference. Here I've just listed 2 example projects. There are several more. The DMP tool is led by California Digital Library, which is also DataCite participating in that, and DMP Online, that one's supported by DCC in Edinburgh. Going further, what if we could document and link all the activities and outputs that go into a research project? I've been following the electronic lab notebook space for a while, and it strikes me that these are tools that can benefit research integrity in many ways. Can help supervisors work with students and postdocs to improve practice, and if made public, can even help people improve their methodologies in the way that GitHub, for example, and similar code repositories help developers and computer scientists work together to improve. Center for Open Science is another example here at the bottom half of the slide. That was founded by Brian Nosek, who I mentioned earlier as one of the lead authors on that seminal psychology replication crisis paper in 2015. The OSF platform that enables pre-registration, open data, methods publication, and so on. I see that as overlapping with repositories, digital notebooks, and even a little bit with CRIS systems. So imagine if a researcher made the whole package available for community review. That is definitely a lot harder to fake than just a manuscript. All of these technologies, of course, need infrastructure to underpin them. So this is another important area of technology investment that's needed. One important component of that is persistent identifiers. Now, full disclosure, I should say that we at MoreBrains have done a lot of work on PIDs, particularly national PID strategies for a number of different countries. What I want you to take away from this slide, and what I want to make you aware of, is that PIDs are much more than just identifiers for things. They also have metadata attached to them that sit in registries. Just like those ORCID trust markers, if the assertions around connections between people, institutions, outputs, data, and so forth are all mapped in a trusted way, and it's recorded who's making that assertion, then we have a much more transparent and reliable scholarly record. Now, last shout out to RAID. I'm a member of the RAID advisory board, so I have to be honest there. RAID is a new persistent identifier that is being developed by the Australian Research Data Commons. They're also being supported by DataCite and will make use of DataCite's DOIs. The idea is that it creates an open standard data structure for information about projects. That creates a timeline and a digital paper trail for a project that could be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Since it uses an open metadata registry, that information could move from research management system to research management system. It's already been integrated into one of the leading CRIS systems in Australia called Redbox, and the Open Science Framework, which I mentioned earlier, are also in talks to integrate it. So that is my talk. In conclusion, my thesis is that technology plays an important part in research integrity, but on its own, it's a double-edged sword. It enables bad actors as much as it enables us to fight them, so we need to do more. Research integrity is a socio-technical problem, and the technology solutions that we aim at it need to enable transparency and accountability, rather than simply being something that works at the point of enforcement. All right, so that is my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Phil. I think that was a Perfect segue into our last session with different of the more granular solutions. But first of all, from the audience, are there any questions to Phil? It was exactly what I had hoped for, not just arguing for technology, but for a good mix, as Martin did as well. Any questions?
I have stunned the audience into silence.
No, absolutely not. I have one. You mentioned, and I had a conversation with John when we met at London Book Fair last week. You spoke about paper mills and the negative potential they have because of their scalability and probably also agility to adjust to new market conditions.
Yeah.
So John had a lot of interesting examples as well, how these paper mills would adapt. Do you think that the publishing ecosystem, probably also the ecosystem around research integrity offices in universities, monitors the activity well enough so that we understand now how these paper mills are developing and probably will develop? So is there kind of predictive element to it?
That's a really good question. I think that a lot of people are putting a lot of work into trying to understand the footprint of paper mills and what they're doing, and they're doing a lot of really good investigations. A lot of that investigation is going in, taking place amongst publishers, like the stuff that's going on at Wiley, and even the stuff that John's talking about that they do at their at their publishing house. I think it's a very challenging thing to do. And so I think that the reality is that we don't understand enough about what paper mills are doing, and we don't understand enough about where they're going. I think that we tend to be sort of a little bit on the back foot, that we tend to notice the patterns after the patterns have emerged in the literature. So it's really hard to sort of stay ahead of it, which is why I advocate for this, trying to get away from this tech arms race thing and not treating it at the point of enforcement, right? If it's just a publisher job, as others have said today, right, then we're in trouble, right? It has to be something that goes through the entire sort of scholarly supply chain, and transitioning to more open methodologies that allows us to create that digital paper trail is really that's the end run around this stuff, that we need to do, so that we basically make it worthless. We need to subtract the value from it, rather than trying to fight it in the way that we are now in terms of firefighting.
Yeah, super. And Kavi Bazagan's question kind of falls exactly into that same direction, saying, excellent point, Phil. How about a manuscript having links to all data? For example, clicking a figure and being linked to the original data, so full provenance.
Yeah. Data linking is a really good idea. There's lots of experiments in that sort of field, lots of folks sort of working on that. I think more than that, I think the sort of stuff that they're doing at RAID is really valuable, and the sort of stuff that they're doing at ResearchGraph and the Research Nexus is potentially really valuable around that area. And that's to take the sort of conversation, or the basis of the representation of the research as not just part of the paper, but having a more open method of communication for all aspects of it, and the paper is one component of the research. So I think over-reliance on the paper is part of the problem, right? We think of the paper as the research, whereas the research is actually happening in the institution, and the paper is one output from it. So I agree that linking everything to everything is really valuable, because it really helps everything be interoperable. But I think the true focus needs to be on looking at the project itself and documenting the project itself in all of its facets.
Yeah, super. Last question, next question rather, from Anne Stone, talking a little bit about the cultural values again, coming back to the socio-technological dimension. How can the cultural values within the research community among leaders, as Martin pointed out, cascade across the research institutions within P&T and research integrity offices to uphold? How can the cutting corners and pressures from individual advances be part of this conversation? Who is having it with these stakeholders?
Yeah, so I mean that's quite a complicated question, isn't it? Yeah, it is just about community values, and I think that's really critical. I mean, I did mention in my talk that when in my previous academic career, I was put under pressure to include somebody as a guest author. And and I'm sorry to say, I'm ashamed to say I did, because it was important for maintaining good relations within the lab, and it was just accepted practice. So the conversation went somewhere around like, I'm told by COPE I'm not supposed to do this. Oh no, everybody does that. So there is this sort of normalization of things, and particularly in certain disciplines that extend to the normalization of things like harking and p-hacking and things like that. It's considered sort of not that bad. There's a little bit of a race to the bottom that's caused by those social pressures around publishing. I don't know whether values have to cascade out from anywhere in particular. I think that just in general there needs to be a shift in culture, or a continued improvement in culture, because it's better than it used to be, I think. With in terms of helping people understand how to do things better, in terms of what best practice is, and a more open conversation sort of around it.
Super. Perfect. It's great that we don't solve our problems at least in 2 afternoons at the Charleston in between. Thank you very much for joining us today, Phil, and thanks for your short thoughts and for sharing them. We'll go for a 12-minute or so break now until, where are we, 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and then come back for the kind of power pitches. The idea is not to sell anything to you, but to introduce you to new thoughts and ideas and concepts. And let's see what Neil, Gareth, John, and Elliot have for us. See you in 12 minutes. Thanks so much.